Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to be here with you today. And with this live session, I'll be discussing patents and innovation, especially for data scientists and startups. And this is a subject that I'm very passionate about. And I'm excited to have the opportunity to talk with all of you. And this will be in more of an informal discussion about these topics. And I hope that you're all doing well. That wherever you are in the world, that you're staying safe and healthy. It's a very strange time, difficult time in a lot of ways, and I know that this pandemic is affecting all of us. All of us, but also a lot of us in similar ways. And I just encourage everyone to stay positive, listen to the scientists, stay positive, and know that we'll get through all of this, and we'll come out the other side, and it will all be better for it. Anyway, so I want to talk about a little bit about who am I and what I do and why I'm talking about intellectual property and patents and innovation. So I'm a longtime data scientist. I've been doing data science for over 10 years in a variety of industries, and have also invented. I'm an inventor. I've invented a number of things in the data science space. I've been granted some patents. Have invented a lot of things for various companies that are trade secret and in production. And I also have a JD degree in intellectual property law, and I worked for an IP firm for 3 years. And I have a lot of experience drafting patents and with patent litigation and filing trademarks and just IP in general. And it's something that I'm very, very passionate about. I want to be clear that I'm not offering anyone legal advice for this. That's not something that I do. I'm not a licensed attorney right now, and so my hope is to share some basic principles about intellectual property that'll help you on data science firm with a specialty in R&D and innovation. And I help my clients not only build out their data science team and initiatives from start to end, but also help them identify what intellectual property they have, where the opportunities that they have for inventing things, and I help them invent and work with patent attorneys to file for protection on the things that they've done. This is my real passion, is helping companies with their intellectual property strategy, working with attorneys, but also being on the side of inventing and building things. And I'm uniquely situated as someone who has experience both on the technical side and also on the legal side, as someone who can really help mediate between the technical people, business people, and the attorneys, and helping develop an IP strategy. And so, that's what I do for my clients, and I absolutely love what I'm doing. So let's start with some basics about what intellectual property is and why is it important? Why is it something that data scientists should be aware made from the human mind? It's kind of the general definition. So it's those things that are unique to you or organization that you've come up with or you've invented. Could be the way that you do things. It could be your data that you have. Different types of intellectual property include your brand and things that you've created. And companies that value innovative and unique thought and creative thought of their employees, without a doubt, have a good IP strategy. And intellectual property is something that they think a lot about. And intellectual property doesn't mean that you're just filing a bunch of patents. That can be part of it, but you're treating the ideas that you create and the things that you create as something that's valuable. And indeed they can be valuable. There's a number of reasons why you should consider intellectual property. One, you can think about it as a defensive tactic. How do you protect yourself from competitors who may be copying what you do? How do you maintain that competitive edge? How do you show that you have value in the way that you and your team think about and solve problems has value and is creative. I've worked with a lot of companies who building their intellectual property portfolio is a huge element of them being able to secure additional funding from investors, because the investors can see that there's tangible assets that the company has created in their intellectual property. And there's an offensive element is you can block out competitors. You can increase your negotiation power. You can license your inventions, and there's lots of reasons why having an intellectual property strategy is about to start some of the general types of intellectual property law. And again, this is going to be kind of a brief overview. We're going to talk about what IP is, what makes a good IP strategy in general, and how do you innovate in an organization and encourage innovation. We'll talk about each of those three things, not in a lot of depth, and I think in future live sessions, if there's interest, I'll go into each of those in more depth. And this is also something that I work with my clients in depth, of helping them identify what IP they have, what IP we need to go out and create and invent, and what opportunities will help them get a creative advantage. All right, so general types of intellectual property. There's generally four. I'm going to add in a fifth one to think about that's not traditionally thought of as intellectual property, but it's of particular interest to data scientists and software developers. So first, you have copyrights. Copyrights, most jurisdictions in the world, most countries in the world have a form of copyright, and they typically protect things like works of art, whether it's music or photography or paintings or literature. And one way that data scientists can use copyright is to protect source code. There's lots of reasons for not doing that, and there's other ways to protect, but copyright is one. And in the U.S., the copyrights are handled through a separate office than patents and trademarks. So copyrights are actually through the U.S. Copyright Office and the Library of Congress, whereas the United States Patent and Trademark Office handles trademarks and patents. So you have patents as well, and what a patent does is it grants you an exclusive right or monopoly over a claimed invention. And we'll go into detail in just a minute on what are some basic elements of a patent that you need to know. But different jurisdictions have different types of patents. Generally, there are two or three. There are utility patents where you can patent how things work, and there are design patents where you patent how things look. A design patent is different than a copyright. And if you remember hearing about the huge legal battles between Samsung and Apple, those were all patent litigation, and that was over design patents of how the UI looked. So data scientists, a lot of times, a number of the things that you invent, if you invent a new algorithm or a new method of doing things or analyzing data, that is something that you can patent. And so I'm going to walk through what are some elements of a patent. I'll post a link to this after, but this is a patent that I had issued in December of last year. And it's actually for using an agent-based modeling approach, a genetic approach to machine learning. And so it's a topic I've been interested in for a really long time, and it was fun to get a patent in this space. So this is a U.S. patent. It was also filed internationally, which is PCT. And in a later session, we can go into all the details of that if that's something that's interesting. But the patents typically have, they'll have the inventors listed. The primary inventor is usually the one who made the most contributions, and the other inventors are people who helped. There's an abstract that, similar to a scientific publication, will tell what the patent's about. There's all these different classifications of where that patent fits in relation to other patents. Flow diagram of kind of describing how the patent works. Then you'll have parts which are called the disclosure, which actually describes in detail how the patent works. But the key part of any patent is actually at the very end, called the claims. Let's see if I can find that here. Okay, so this is a little bit out of order, but here at the end I have some patent claims, and they're if you scroll to the end of any patent, or if you look on Google Patents, you have claims at the end, which are each claim is usually one sentence. They're kind of strangely worded legalese, words that stake out your claim of what the patent actually covers. So, it doesn't matter what I put in my disclosure. I could put a whole bunch of stuff in my disclosure. If what I'm trying to cover in my invention is not in the claims, then I can't stop or enforce that against anyone else. And so much of what a patent attorney does is work on the claims, of going back and forth with the patent office to decide, what type of monopoly is the government going to give you on what scope of an idea. And we'll go into that in a lot more detail at some point in the future, maybe a later discussion. But the reason that actively police yourself. So the government grants you a right or protection under intellectual property, but that's something that you as a company have to be aware of. The government's not out there looking to see who's violating patents or who's infringing on a patent. If you have a patent, you have to actively be looking at your competitors and notice if they're doing something that crosses the line on your patent. The same thing with trademarks. If you trademark a logo, and the government's not going to be looking at every new logo and telling you who's infringing on your logo. They will, in the prosecution process, try to limit the ability to give someone a trademark or a patent if someone else has already done that. And typically, so we stick on patents before we move on to other types. There's two general tests in most jurisdictions to determine if something can be patented or not. So there's a difference between can you patent something, and there's and the question, should you patent something? We'll talk about that later when we talk in a couple minutes when I talk about developing an IP strategy. So I've had multiple clients where I've sat down with them and we've identified over 250 things that they could patent. That can be a very expensive thing if you wanted to patent absolutely everything that you could patent. That can be very expensive. IP can be very expensive. So that doesn't mean that you should patent that many things. And there's actually a strategy. When you get a patent, and with a lot of types of intellectual property, the government is giving you a monopoly, but in exchange, you're disclosing how you do what you do, and that becomes public knowledge. And patents and copyrights have a term of how long they're good for, how long you can enforce them. There's only a certain number of years that you can actually enforce those rights of those patents before that just becomes public domain knowledge and anyone can use that. So again, two general tests that the U.S. Patent Office uses, and a lot of other patent offices around the world use, is something, what is being claimed, the invention, is it novel? Meaning, is it something that no one's ever done before? Or if it's not novel, is it something that's non-obvious? So maybe the invention is composed of, or comprised, is what a patent attorney would say, of different parts that are already existing, but is the way that they're combined together something that wouldn't have been thought of before. What we'll go into at a later stage, we can talk about doing a prior art search and what patent examiners in patent offices, what they look for of how to invalidate your patent application and how to do a patent search on your own. But these are all things that patent attorneys are expert at, and more the legal side that if you feel like you have some things that you want patented, I highly recommend getting a good patent attorney and involving them in the discussions on the legal side. Attorneys, though, it can be a mixed bag about helping with the technical side. Usually, in my experience with patent attorneys, they're very good at the legal side of of navigating the bureaucracy of patent offices and the whole legal side of that. But in terms of strategy for the overall organization or on the inventing and the technical side, attorneys a lot of times aren't experts in that. They may have a technical background. In fact, you have to have a technical background to be a patent attorney, but typically it's only kind of academic background and not really an industry background. So we've talked about copyrights. We've talked about patents, talked about trademarks briefly. Trademarks can cover the name of a product or company and or the logo of a product or company. Again, that doesn't necessarily always apply directly to data science, but it does to a lot of startups. And you want to make sure that you consider trademarks when you have a logo and design, and that's an important thing that you need to consider. And then the last, typical thought of intellectual property is called trade secrets. And trade secrets, the formal definition of a trade secret is information that is not generally known to the public, confers economic benefit on its holder because the information is not publicly known, and where the holder makes a reasonable efforts to maintain its secrecy. So it has to be something that everyone doesn't know and that your company is benefiting from because everyone doesn't know. And you have to be showing that you're making reasonable efforts to maintain the secrecy of that. And there's a lot of things in data science that can fall into this trade secret category. This can be your secret sauce. This can be algorithms that you don't want publicly known. This can be data sets that you don't want to be publicly known. This can be pre-processing pipelines and all other kinds of things that are the secret sauce that give you a competitive advantage. And you want to make sure that you're considering trade secrets as a valuable part of your intellectual property strategy. And it's important a lot of times to consult with an attorney about how you can make sure that you are treating trade secrets appropriately. There's a number of things that, depending on the jurisdiction, that you need to do, if you remember that last point of the definition, that you need to do to show a court that you've made reasonable efforts to maintain the secrecy of your trade secret. That this includes things like having things appropriately password protected, having confidentiality or NDA agreements in place, and other things like that. Okay, so the 4 types of traditional intellectual property are, copyrights, trademarks, patents, trade secret. And the last one that I view as a type of intellectual property, but is not one that traditionally is actually open source. For a lot, this is kind of the opposite philosophy as a lot of the other intellectual property where you're protecting something. But for a lot of companies, moving or sharing some of what they do in open source, there's a lot of really good reasons for doing that. And when you look at companies in the data science space like H2O, Anaconda, RStudio, even Google and Facebook, they all have portions of intellectual property that they've created that they've opened up to the open source community, and that's another very important part of data science and something to consider the trade-offs for doing that. Okay, so we've talked about the different types of intellectual property. Let's talk about how do you create an IP strategy, and how do you know what you should patent and what you shouldn't patent. How do you know if something is intellectual property? And before we kind of get into that, I want to reiterate that if your company values creativity, values innovation and new thinking, you need to have an IP strategy. That needs to be something that is important to you. That doesn't mean spending thousands of dollars on filing patents necessarily, but it does mean having a deliberate IP strategy of how you're protecting your intellectual property. So I worked for a company where when I was hired, they told me that they really valued intellectual property, but after working there for a long time, it became very clear that they weren't interested in new ideas. They weren't interested in an intellectual property strategy, and they just wanted to do what they've always been doing. I had another data scientist who worked there at the same time that I did. It's a very brilliant man, and in his first 6 weeks at this company, he invented over 20 different things that could have been patented related to a project. And the reaction from when he presented this kind of phenomenal effort of things that he had created, the reaction from the executives was just confusion, and they were actually kind of mad that he had spent all this effort because they didn't see the value of it. And I think that is such a huge loss for that company, and absolutely the wrong way to treat that. Our R&D can take time, and it's often a balance between a company has to make money. You can't spend unlimited time on R&D projects, especially if you're a smaller mid-sized business, which is why a lot of the innovation that we see comes out of universities or big companies like Facebook and Google that have an R&D budget. However, for many small and mid-sized businesses, there's an absolute balance between doing the day-to-day of what needs to get done and pay the bills, but also thinking forward to the future and developing new and creative solutions to help existing work go better and help gain a competitive advantage in the marketplace. And if you don't see the value in that, intellectual property is not something that you need to worry about. Except that we've talked a lot about how intellectual property can help you assert your rights against other people. But you need to remember that there's going to be other people and competitors that have their own intellectual property. And so even if you are not thinking about an IP strategy at all in your company, and you're just kind of going along doing things, there's always the chance that someone else will try to assert a patent against you, or that you're infringing something that they have done. So a good IP strategy is defensive as well as offensive. Okay, for the organization at a strategic level. So are you a startup, and are you looking to raise funding? And how do you think that relates to your intellectual property strategy? A lot of startups want to place a priority on filing and protecting their inventions as a way to raise extra money and to show their investors that they're a creative team. So that's one reason, intellectual property. Another reason, are you looking to block out competitors? Are there competitors in the space that you want to get a leg up on and get out in front of them? And intellectual property can be a great tool for that. So you want to identify what are your, before you begin, what are your goals for intellectual property? It's not a good reason to file for a patent or protect your intellectual property just because everyone else is doing it. You should have a real business reason for doing that, and this will make it easier to get everyone on board if they can see the value of why you need an intellectual property strategy. So then then the next step. So now that you know what your goal is for intellectual property, what are you looking to do with it? The next step is to figure out, well, what do we have that needs to be protected? So start generally with anything that you would not want your competitors to know about, or that makes you and the way that you do things at your company unique compared to other companies. And that can be a great place to just start making a list of everything. And often with my clients, I go through brainstorming and we'll say, okay, well, here, what are the things that you think give you a competitive edge that you do differently? And we'll start fleshing these out, and I'll be able to help brainstorm, say, well, what about if you did this way? That can be a whole patent in and of itself. And it's really easy for me, one talent that I have, to think of things that could be patented. So that's where you start out with is what's the list of everything that we could protect, and then you want to kind of take step 1 and 2 together. Okay, given our strategy, how do we place the things that we could protect into a priority of what needs to be protected? There's a number of factors to consider with this. One is to think about, is there something on the list that is kind of foundational to a bunch of other items on the list? Is there kind of a core technology that you've developed that a bunch of other things that you've developed fall underneath? That could be a good candidate for getting priority. Is there a particular competitor that you feel like maybe is close to encroaching on something that you're doing, maybe that can give a priority. Is there something kind of with marketing or new product launch that you're contemplating on the horizon? Maybe that's something that you want to give priority to. And so you want to start prioritizing of basically the things that you've identified, what should get the most priority. And it's helpful a lot of times to think about things in terms of families or grouping related things together. A really good patent attorney can take one core patentable idea and file a bunch of family members is what they're called, or continuation of parts or branches off that patent that expand kind of your first initial protection of one patent into a whole family that blocks out an entire segment of your industry for you. And so, a good patent attorney will think about that in ways, and will also think about ways to help you prioritize your filing of patents and stagger it so you don't have all the costs all at once, and you can spread that out. So this is a strategy is a great place to involve a patent attorney, and they can give specific legal advice. But I recommend doing that after you've worked internally or with someone like me to identify what are our goals with IP and what do we even have that we could protect. A lot of times those are two things that you need to have a good handle on before you talk with a patent attorney. Okay, so we've talked about briefly what is intellectual property. We've talked about how do you create an IP strategy. Some things that you can look for when you're looking whether or not to patent something. And let's talk about now about how do you innovate, especially if you're at a small or mid-sized company or startup. How do you innovate? I've noticed that at least in the data science profession, there's two general types of data scientists, and it's not really binary. But I've noticed that a lot of times there's two camps. There's people that are more on the science and R&D side, and there's people that are more on the engineering side. And I think software developers a lot of times are more on the, or software engineers are more on the engineering side, where it's you start with a problem that we have, and then there's a prescribed solution for that. There's these libraries that I need to use, these methods that I need to do. And this is a lot of data science, especially building out are problems that have already been solved a lot of times at companies like Facebook or Google. And the data scientist is just implementing a recipe. If we're doing a standard NLP analysis, here are the steps that you follow. And many of us, we'll find a blog post or tutorial and we'll follow the steps. And that's how we'll solve a data science problem. And that can be entirely effective. There's a lot that can be done by just applying the state of the art or the standard data science practices. But you can't patent or innovate if you're just doing what everyone else is doing, even if you're doing what everyone else is doing, but it hasn't been done at your company. You need, in order to innovate, you need to be doing something that is either novel or non-obvious, that is different. And so a couple tips that I have, for that is, first, I just kind of talked about this. If you think about it like cooking, it's one thing to be a good cook and to be a good cook by following a recipe. I know a number of people who can't follow a recipe and are not good cooks. And I know a lot of people who are really great at following recipes and are excellent cooks. But the best cooks or chefs that I know are ones that don't necessarily need a recipe, that they've internalized and understand the components of a recipe so well that they can go out and they can create new things. Innovating is exactly the same way. And the first thing that this is why I love kind of taking a scientific approach at innovating. If you focus on problems of trying to understand the core of what needs to happen at a problem, and let go of how prior things, how people have solved that problem in the past, and think about what needs to happen at its core. And that I had a partner at a law firm that I worked for remarked that he a lot of people don't realize that a lot of times an invention or an innovation is identifying that there's a problem that has a solution. um, and often, and he observed this because a lot of the foundational patents, you go back and you look at them and it seems really obvious and you think, oh, why didn't I think of that's really simple. But at the time it was not obvious. Oftentimes the best inventions are those type of things where it's not obvious at the time, but someone had an idea of, oh, I can solve this in a simple and elegant way. And then everyone looking back is like, okay, that was so easy. Why didn't we do that before? um, and some ways that I've been able to help do that. One, I have I have a weird background from a data scientist. I started in biology and in ecology and evolution. I've spent a lot of time in marketing and startups, and I have a legal background, and so I tend to look at the world a little bit differently than other data scientists. And so that kind of lets me approach problems a different way. But I think um, you need to strike a balance between understanding the details of your problem and looking at the big picture. So I remember, a couple of years ago, I was working for a company, and we had a client that had asked us to develop a novel. They had a hypothesis that they were studying a neurological disease with different subtypes of that disease, and they had a hypothesis that there were more subtypes in that disease than were in the published literature, and they wanted to see if a blood assay could be used. Proteomic assay could be used to subtype or classify the disease. And this required us to think about, initially the initial quick data science problem is, oh, this is a clustering problem, unsupervised. See if we can, if we can predict. So it could be a supervised problem or an unsupervised problem. Supervised, can we predict the existing classes that are assigned by doctors to this neurological disease? And unsupervised, if you're just using proteins, can you, are there natural groupings into what, how this disease behaves and looks like at a protein level? And so we started with the traditional clustering approaches, k-means, dbScan, model-based clustering, hierarchical clustering, and it became very clear as we did that this wasn't going to get us the information that we need, and that in a biological system, there are a number of reasons why these existing approaches didn't work. And after working and wrestling on this for a number of weeks, I had the idea, I don't remember if I was in the shower or driving to work or something, of a completely different way of approaching a clustering problem in a biological context that made sense, where one problem with a lot of clustering approaches is there's not really variable importance. That if you think about k-means, every column is treated with equal, in straight up vanilla k-means, every column is unweighted so that it has equal weight and contributes to the distance. But in a biological system, a person may have hundreds of proteins, but not every single protein is associated with the disease. And it's a particular problem if you don't know if those proteins are, or which proteins are associated with the disease, or which grouping of. So anyway, we came up with a way of doing that. But we got to that point because we tried kind of the initial approaches, but we took a step back and trying to understand what's the core problem that we're trying to solve, and what are other ways that we can get to solve that problem. One prior boss that I had, who had a number of patents itself, he would always say, if we were stuck on a problem, let's turn the problem on its head. Let's just think about where we're at right now and where do we want to go, and ignore all the steps in between. Data scientists are really good about saying, pulling out their recipes of, oh, here's how I get from A to B. But if you just start with, here's where I am, this is the goal that we need to accomplish, and then think creatively about how you can get there. That's a great place for to be in for innovating. Um, so it helps, it helps to think about the big picture. It helps to think about doing things differently, and not doing them differently just for the sake of doing them differently, but think about how the problem, how the existing approaches don't solve the problems that you're faced with. And this is actually a way that I get asked a lot. Facebook and Google, they're the ones producing all these algorithms. If I'm just a small company in this niche industry, is there really room for me to innovate? And absolutely, you don't have to have an invention that applies to every single company, in so many different situations like Google or Facebook might. But you can absolutely come up with a way of solving a problem, a unique way of solving, and a better way of solving a problem within your specific context. Anyway, so uh, just to give an overview of what this has been about before, we've talked about, in general, different types of intellectual property. We've talked about a few considerations for creating an intellectual or an IP strategy for your company. We've talked about some tips of how to innovate and how to think about things differently. And I wanted to spend, we're just going to have a couple more minutes. I wanted to see if any of the attendees had any specific questions. I have 5 minutes set aside for questions. So there's a live chat on the side. If you have a question, about patenting or about intellectual property or innovation, now's a great time to ask that. And I'll wait for a couple minutes to see if anyone has any questions. All right, so I have one question about, and I touched on this a little bit, but we'll talk a little bit about more in detail. Is what exactly should a company look to patent? And I think this question cannot be answered without understanding what your goals are for intellectual property. Every company, especially in the data science space, should have an IP strategy. That IP strategy does not need to include filing for patents if it doesn't make sense. But you should have goals of how are you protecting the confidential and proprietary information and know-how in your company, and what are you going to do with that? And how you decide what to patent directly relates back to that, of how you can best achieve that goal. And again, this is something that I do a lot with my clients, and I really enjoy helping them do this, helping them get ready for their attorneys to file, but also help. There's so much of an IP strategy that happens outside of what an attorney can do, of kind of the internal strategy and the messaging of working with product and marketing departments, working with the technical people, and really helping create that culture of, we're proud of that we can think of new and creative and better ways of doing things, and we're going to protect and value that. All right, so any last questions before I sign off? All right, so if you have any questions, or you're watching this or a recording, feel free to contact me on LinkedIn, or email me or contact me through my website, www.methoddatascience.com. I hope that you all are staying safe and healthy and positive, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you all soon.